Dispatch to MD-1032. How's it looking down there? Once inside the complex, you'll be pretty much on your own. Security should be light, but best be on your guard anyway. I'll check in with you shortly. Take care. Over and out.
Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, and we're kicking off our look back at the Windows sequels to DOS games with Descent 3. Now, something I want to state right off the bat is that this game is a freaking nightmare to try and get working on modern systems, and even right now, you may be able to notice that it's not running perfectly, as the font's not very smooth, kind of small, and there's the occasional skip when it goes to load textures into the GPU. There's actually a couple ways to go about setting this game up nowadays, one of which works pretty well for just playing the game, the other of which doesn't work as well, which is what I'm doing here, but it's better for recording, so that's what I was stuck with. Anyways, Descent 3 originally came out for Windows 95 and 98 back in 1999, though development had started not long after Descent 2 originally came out, when Parallax Software split into two different companies. The two companies included Volition, which made the Descent Free Space games, the Saint Rose series, and a number of other games, and the other company was Outrage Entertainment, which obviously made Descent 3, and they made a couple other games before getting bought up by THQ and then given the axe in 2004. Now, even though it doesn't look it, this game plays pretty much exactly as you'd expect given the first couple Descent games. In fact, when development of Descent 3 began, the devs had set up an online forum specifically to ask fans of the series what they wanted out of a third game. And this is ultimately why Descent 3 retains so much from the original games, while at the same time greatly expanding on what players could do. I actually tried to find out if these dev forums still existed, as amazingly a lot of the original Descent 3 news and uploads are still floating around out there, but I didn't have any luck. Actually, when you start up Descent 3, you get quite the cinematic sequence, with some incredible music to go with it, setting the tone for a game which ultimately ties up many of the loose ends of the first two games. We also get to finally see the face of the Material Defender.
Not bad, considering.
Yup, that is the face of an experienced mercenary for hire right there. Yeah, late 90s CGI wasn't exactly the greatest. We all kind of expected him to look a bit tougher, but hey, at least these cinematics finally ended the debate of whether he was speaking his mind to Dravis in the original game, or just reading his thoughts aloud.
No one wants to mess with the PTMC.
Great. Ruthless corporate bureaucrats on one side, amateur do-gooders on the other.
I've also got to mention, PC games are notorious for having lousy endings, way back in the 80s and even nowadays. But this is not one of them. The ending to Descent 3 is a fairly lengthy cinematic that feels very satisfying, especially given the 20 plus hours of gameplay you gotta go through to get it. That's right, you heard me. 20 hours minimum. This is an extraordinarily long game. There's only 15 levels, but each of these 15 levels is just downright massive, and you often have multiple objectives to complete in order to clear them. Sometimes with a little backtracking, but the level designs are usually pretty good about that, and you still have an auto map you can access if you get lost. Actually, one of the neat things about the auto map ties in with how D3's underlying game engine works, in that you'll see pulsing white walls representing places that you have yet to explore. The engine itself was Outrage's own design, called the Fusion Engine. The idea being that it fused outdoor and indoor sections together seamlessly, as up to this point in time, games were typically optimized for one or the other, but not both. So being able to transition between believable indoor and outdoor environments without loading screens was kind of a big selling point for the game. There's also a fairly well done physics system here, long before believable physics were common in games, though it's not really used to any great effect and has strict limitations as to what kinds of objects it can handle. Though one change which kind of confused some people at first was why the cockpit of your ship looks so different when you first start playing, even though it's made clear that you're flying a Pyro. Well, this ship from the first couple games was the Pyro GX. Here you're flying a Pyro GL, which is similar but not quite the same. Later in the game though, you get access to two more ships to fly, one of which is built for speed at the cost of attack power and defense, while the other is way more powerful and defensive, but a bit slower. There's also an expansion pack, which once again gave you access to the Pyro GX, but a specially modified variant, which could dual fire basic missiles like the concussion and homing missiles. It's also pertinent to point out that many weapons from the original game made it back into this one, but not necessarily usable by the player. For instance, the Mercury missiles from Descent 2 made it in, but only as an enemy-fired weapon. The player is never able to obtain them. There's actually a number of brand new weapons the player has access to as well, and while most of the new weapons are okay, there's a couple that really don't feel like anything special. The microwave cannon and the cyclone missiles are easily the two weakest additions, as the microwave cannon just feels like a worse plasma cannon substitute, while the cyclone missiles require wide open areas to even have a chance of hitting anything. I'd have loved to see the spread fire or helix cannons return, and maybe some other kind of ordnance that would be just more useful in general. Speaking on that point, another interesting change is that there's no longer extra lives. If you die, you return to a silent checkpoint or the start of the level, and have to work your way back to where you died to reacquire all of your equipment, just like in the past games. I think it would have been cool if they put in a simple penalty for death, such as dropping your laser levels, but then they didn't put the laser levels back in. You have blue regular lasers and yellow super lasers, and no others. The one thing that's very intriguing about this game over the previous ones is the collision detection. The collision detection is almost too good, making it possible to get yourself stuck in tight places because you managed to finagle your way in, and now you have to finagle your way out again in much the same way you got there. Plus, the accuracy of all this makes it incredibly difficult to hit stuff, since you have to be super precise with your shots. On the flip side, the enemies also have to deal with this too, so dodging massive amounts of enemy shots is, well, surprisingly easy at long range, and actually still relatively simple at medium range, though some enemies are just like, screw it, and just come blazing at you at full speed, ready to literally tear your weapons out of your ship. And these enemies can actually be extraordinarily annoying, and they kind of make up almost half of all the enemies you fight. There's also a puzzle element to the game now, possibly inspired by Tomb Raider, especially considering the mutated Martian tribes found on level 6. Yeah, it's seriously a thing in this game. Now, since the mission objectives no longer come down to just blowing up reactor cores, many times you'll have to solve some sort of movement, switch, or inventory puzzle to proceed with the mission. For instance, the second level of the game is a prison compound which you're trying to break someone out of. You not only have to get rid of the outer defenses, but once inside, you have to figure out which keys get you past which security stations, find the guy you're looking for, who happens to be kept under maximum security, then find a way to get him transferred up to minimum security. This is a lot of steps for a 90s action game where 99% of what you do is just shoot stuff. Oh yeah, they brought back the Thief Bot from Descent 2 as well, cause everyone loves the Thief Bot. No one loves the Thief Bot. Although at least they toned it down a shade. It often has to run into you more than once to succeed at stealing something, so you have more chances to avoid this happening. Plus, it doesn't move nearly as erratically, so it's easier to get a bead on it with your shots. The Guidebot makes a return as well, and is even given way more usefulness than before, including its own power-ups it can collect and use. Though, quite frankly, I just keep the Guidebot stashed away in my ship when I play, as I never really enjoyed having to suspend the gameplay just to give it orders. Speaking of the robots, the AI is way more challenging to deal with here than ever before. Descent 2 introduced the concept of adaptive enemy AI, which would change their most basic tactics based on simple factors, though it's hard to know that this is happening without first spending many hours playing the game, then trying to play it right from the start again using a brand new pilot file, which you don't normally have to do because you can just start a new game from any level you've previously reached. Descent 3, on the other hand, doesn't have adaptive AI, but instead has intelligent AI. Robots will dodge your attacks, respond to sound effects, utilize different weapons based on range, attempt to escape when heavily damaged, only to turn around and fight back if you follow them. Plus, some enemies have special AI considerations, such as these tiny little probes which are designed to strike the instant they see you, then immediately begin an escape in order to alert other enemies of your presence. But most of the time you'll never actually notice any of this advanced AI stuff taking place, which is actually exactly how it should be. The enemies behave so naturally that you don't spend any time questioning their tactics. Unless they get stuck behind a wall or something. But then given that this stuff like this just doesn't happen that often, it's easy to believe it's just the enemies making mistakes, which again makes them feel more real. And that pretty much covers all of the basics. So now let's talk about actually getting this game and getting it running. Firstly, you'll notice that none of the Descent games are available for digital download anymore. There's actually a fairly simple reason for this. Parallax Software never technically shut down. This was something I noticed a very long time ago after the Volition Outrage split, was that Parallax Software was still around despite the split. And I never realized until later that it was in order to maintain proper licensing rights with Interplay for selling the Descent games. However, in recent years, Interplay was failing to pay royalties to Parallax Software on those sales. And after trying to work things out, the Parallax guys ultimately had to pull the plug. Unfortunately, the spirit of the Descent games lives on in a couple of ways. The Parallax guys founded a new company, Revival Productions, and are currently at work on a spiritual successor to the Descent series called Overload, which is in early access on Steam, and from what I've seen, pretty much looks like the Descent 4 that we've all been waiting for, even if not by name. There's also a game in the works called Descent Underground, which is basically looking to be a brand new story set in the Descent universe, which is being worked on by an entirely different developer, Descended Studios. The response to Descent Underground so far has been kind of mixed, at least as far as I can tell, though given that they focused mostly on multiplayer since starting development, I can imagine that's part of the reason why. A good Descent game really does need a single-player campaign to go with it, and that's apparently what they're going to be focusing on very soon, although without the early access they gave to the multiplayer. But yeah, if you want a copy of Descent 3 right now, your best bet is buying a used copy online. Copies typically run between $15 and $30 for the original game, and slightly less for the Mercenary expansion pack. Also, be aware that there's a special release of Descent 3 called Sol Ascent, which came bundled with various computers and video cards, but only contains the first third of the game, which admittedly is still over 6 hours of gameplay. Regardless of anything though, be aware of what you're getting yourself into when you go hunting this game down. Descent 3 does not run very well with modern hardware, at least without using third-party software. If you intend to play the game on a machine from the late 90s or early 2000s, you should be fine. But anything from the Windows Vista era onwards, you're likely going to run into minor problems, and with Windows 8 or 10, it's going to be quite the hassle getting this going. So, here's my secret for getting this going with Windows 10. A handy little program called DX Wind. DX Wind is an exceptionally powerful tool which hooks into DirectX and other DLLs, intercepting the calls from them and passing them on after making slight changes to how they're being handled. DX Wind is pretty much necessary for getting late 90s and early 2000s era Windows games working right, if they haven't been patched for modern systems since. I mean, you can run Descent 3 without DX Wind and likely get it working, but it's probably not going to work as well as it should, especially when it comes to the screen resolution and the frame rate. Now, if all you want to do is play Descent 3 on a modern Windows system, you only need DX Wind and a legit copy of the game. You need to do a full install of the game, all movie files and everything, and then patch the game up with the patches that are out there. I should point out that the Descent 3 installer may actually take several minutes to launch properly for some reason. Once it does though, it should work fine. Next, you need to launch DX Wind and create a new entry in its program list. Now, I'm not gonna lie, from this point forwards, you kinda have to have an idea of what you're doing or nothing here is gonna make any sense, and I could dedicate several videos to trying to explain this all. So, if the following doesn't work, there may be more you need to do for your system in particular. In any case, here's the steps I took. Step 1. Name your new program entry. The name doesn't really matter, so I just called mine Descent 3. Step 2. Set the folder to match where you installed Descent 3. Set the launch executable to descent3.exe, and set the path executable to main.exe. Step 3. Check the run in window box, and also make sure keep aspect ratio is checked. This game does not run well full screen on a widescreen monitor. Step 4. The initial window position doesn't matter, but make sure you set the size to the resolution that you want the game to run at. 1280 by 960 is good to go with for a 1080p monitor. Step 5. Go to the video tab and make sure you check both initial and max resolution and set it to the window res that you're going with that you're going to run the game at. It's also a good idea to set the window size and position to a locked size. Step 6. Go to the OpenGL tab and check the boxes for hooking OpenGL and for hooking GLUT32. Now, this should do it for DX Wind configuration. So long as DxWind is running, it'll automatically hook into Descent 3 if you run the launcher, or you can double-click the entry in the DxWind program list and run it that way. Now in the launcher, there's a few more things you need to do. Step 7. Make sure to redetect available devices and select OpenGL as your primary rendering device. Direct3D may work right depending on the age of your video card, but likely won't if you have anything even remotely recent. Step 8. Make sure you have the joystick you want to use selected in the Controls tab, otherwise you're not going to be able to use it in-game. Step 9. In the MISC tab, there's a box for entering command line options. Now, there's a bunch of these which people tend to recommend, but the absolute minimum you should put in here are as follows: -framecap 999, -bumped, -highmem, -highvidmem. And that should do it. You may also want to set up vertical sync in your graphics drivers, but the game should run playable like this. It won't be recordable though, just playable. If you try to record it with software like OBS, you're going to encounter numerous glitches. So if you want to record your gameplay, you're going to need to set things up slightly differently. And you're going to need a second piece of third-party software called ADG Voodoo 2. ADG Voodoo 2 is a program which wraps the Glide API through Direct3D, allowing software made to run natively on 3DFX Voodoo chipsets to work with Direct3D instead. Now, this makes setting up the game a bit trickier. You still need to set up DxWind the same way, but instead of hooking OpenGL, you want to hook the Glide lives from the Hook tab. As for ADG Voodoo 2 itself, there's a ton of settings to adjust, so I'm just going to show you all some screen caps of how I have it set, but I will step you all through the basics of getting ADG Voodoo 2 doing anything at all. Step 1. Install ADG Voodoo 2 wherever you want it and run it. Step 2. Add a new config folder in the program pointing to your Descent 3 folder. Step 3. Set up the settings in each tab. Again, I have my settings pasted on screen right now, but you may have better mileage with different settings. Step 4. Go to the folder you installed ADG Voodoo 2 into and copy the 6 DLL files in the extra folders straight into your Descent 3 folder. Don't copy the folders over, just the DLLs. Step 5. When you run the launcher now, redetect the available devices and select Glide as your rendering device. Now, theoretically, you don't need DxWind on top of ADG Voodoo 2 for playing the game using the Glide API on a modern system. But if you don't, all calls to change the screen resolution are going to be honored, which means your desktop is liable to be a giant mess when all is said and done. Plus, even though you can tell ADG Voodoo 2 to run windowed by default, these resolution changes will still trip the full screen mode anyways if DxWind isn't stopping it from doing so. I've also found that every resolution or windowed mode change has a chance to crash the game on modern Windows, which is going to really suck if you end up stuck having to fix everything with your desktop running at 640 by 480. Also, alt-tabbing works way worse this way, and again has a chance to crash the game. I only recommend this setup if you want to record your gameplay using a software solution, otherwise stick with the OpenGL method from earlier. Last thing I should mention is that I haven't tested either of these setups with multiplayer. Descent 3 actually has a ton of multiplayer modes and maps right out of the box, but from what I understand, getting it working multiplayer nowadays can be a little tricky in its own right. I have no idea how well the methods above work with modern multiplayer configuration, but feel free to leave some comments to let everyone know if you have any experience as such. Anywho, I thoroughly enjoyed Descent 3 back in the day, and going back to play it again after all these years, it still holds up, despite some of its shortcomings and annoying puzzles. And it just sucks that it's such a pain to get working. Hopefully one day they'll release the source code to the game, because then fan translations of the engine to a modern system would be way more likely. But given what ended up happening to Outrage, who knows if the source code is even still out there anymore. In any case, that's all for today's filler. Next one's going to be on Saturday, November 25th, and we're going to be taking a look at the only Windows sequel I have lined up, which runs in full 3D, but does not have hardware accelerated graphics. Well, once again, there's a handful of games that could be, so be sure to send your guests to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned because there's plenty more of these sequels to dive into.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample, you guys.